Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Bill Clifford, President and CEO of the World Affairs Councils of America. I'm delighted to invite you to this program today, Cover to Cover, our monthly author series. And we have two, not one, but two fantastic guests for you today. They are Robin Broad and John Cavanagh, husband and wife team that has co-authored this extremely interesting book called The Water Defenders: How Ordinary People Saved a Country from Corporate Greed. Robin and John, I just learned, have traveled the world, met in New Jersey some years ago, married, and they've written a number of things together. Robin is an expert in international development and won a prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship for her work on this project, as well as two previous MacArthur Fellowships. She's a professor at American University and has served as an international economist at the U.S. Treasury Department, in the U.S. Congress, and at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. John Cavanagh is director of the Washington, D.C.-based Institute for Policy Studies, an organization that collaborates with the Poor People's Campaign and other dynamic social movements to turn ideas into action for peace, justice, and the environment. We want to get to know IPS a little bit more at WACA. The two of them have helped build a network of international allies that spearheaded the global fight against mining in El Salvador, which is the country of focus in this book. They've done comic books, they've done articles, some scholarly books before. This one is really like John Grisham's Pelican Brief, I say, and I can't wait to hear from you. So, ladies and gentlemen, you can ask your questions in the chat box. You can submit them by email to Laura Duncan, lduncan@worldaffairscouncils.org. She'll get them to me. I hope we have a very interactive discussion this afternoon. And Robin and John, welcome to Cover to Cover.
Wonderful to be with you.
Thank you, Bill. And we've been waiting to be compared to John Grisham for a while.
Well, that's no joke. I mean, I got to say, I'm struck by the suspense of the story. You give it away in the title. I mean, the little guy takes on corporations and wins, but you want to read every chapter of this book. So before getting into the narrative, Robin, ladies first, and also because you have a vaccine coming, or you're dealing with your second vaccine and may drop away, we don't want that. Why don't you start by sharing how it is, your expertise is elsewhere. How did you two fall into El Salvador?
So, Bill, thank you. That is, of course, the perfect opening question. We didn't plan it, but it's the perfect opening question. It's how we open the book. And you've read the book, so you know that. But I'm tempted to read, maybe for 40 minutes from the book, but I won't do that because, of course, we want your audience to buy the book. But we weren't supposed to be a part of the story. We weren't supposed to be doing work on El Salvador. But we got into this starting in July, the summer of 2009, so more than a decade ago, when people in El Salvador sent us the shocking news that a 37-year-old teacher and cultural worker named Marcelo Rivera had been brutally assassinated. His mangled body was found in the bottom of a dry well. Now, I need to add, we had never met Marcelo Rivera, but we knew his name well because he was one of 5 people from El Salvador, from a group called La Mesa, the Roundtable on Metallic Mining in El Salvador, who were supposed to come to Washington, D.C. in October of that year to receive a prestigious human rights award that John's Institute, the Institute for Policy Studies, gives out every year. And so the award was for La Mesa's pioneering work to keep mining out of El Salvador, given mining's toxicity and given El Salvador's fragile ecosystem. And I'm sure we'll get into that more. Yeah. But so 3 months later, 5 water defenders came to Washington. And I'm getting goosebumps as I tell this story, say this, in Marcelo's place came his younger brother and best friend, Marcelo. And
Miguel.
I'm sorry, Miguel, channeling Marcelo, Miguel. So it was a very large, hundreds of people at the National Press Club. And as the 5 water defenders tell their story, as part of their story, they talked about Marcelo's murder, they talked about the toxic effects of mining, and they talked about a related event unfolding 4 blocks away at the National Press Club, where some of your listeners, I'm sure, have been, from the National Press Club, 4 blocks away in the World Bank Group, where a mining company had sued the government of El Salvador for not allowing it to mine in Miguel and Marcelo's hometown. That's in the, so let me just finish quickly. At the end of the event, Miguel, who we really didn't know, came over to talk to us. And he was in grief, he was in shock, but he was incredibly focused. And he said to us, you have to help us understand what's going on in that arbitration court at the World Bank Group, because we don't understand how a company can be suing our government over what happens to our hometown, but it's going to be heard in a court in Washington, D.C. And we had studied the World Bank for years, but we knew almost nothing about this court. But what would you do? I mean, what would anyone do with a request like that from someone whose brother had just been assassinated? So we said yes.
It sounds like you're going to pack your bags.
No, we said yes, thinking we were volunteering to do a day or 2 of pro bono research. And that is, of course, not what happened.
That isn't what happened. John, what happened took you almost annually for several years up until 2019, I think, to really become investigative reporters and try and support La Mesa, this group of water defenders. But the problem began before that. Can you set the stage and give us a little context of what the mining companies were looking to do in El Salvador? And maybe this is asking too many questions at once, but we're going to get into what is development. You both know this subject very well. We're talking about some of the poorest regions of a very poor country. It isn't even mining potentially a godsend?
Right. Sure. No, very, very well put. And I just want to say, I mean, one final footnote on Robin's story. I'm sure everyone in the audience has had this happen to them. This is a beautiful example of people in developing countries organizing people in richer countries to work with them. So they were brilliant. The 5 of them had us set up a tour for them through the US and Canada. That pulled in a lot of other groups. So it wasn't just Robin and me or the Institute for Policy Studies. It was a whole set of groups in the US, then Canada, then Australia, then elsewhere. But to your point, mining has been going on and off in much of the world for hundreds of years, but in particular, since the great gold rushes and the big mining booms of the 1850s and 60s. El Salvador was one of the countries that was found to have gold in the early 1900s. And so it, like many other countries, mining came and went as gold and other mineral prices went up and down. This story begins because in the early 2000s, mineral prices started to go up rapidly. Lots of reasons, part of it China becoming a voracious consumer of it, part of it our cell phones, and so on. As that happened, the prices of gold and other minerals went up. That made places that weren't so interesting to mining companies for a long time interesting again, and El Salvador was one of those. So people in the north, we tell a great story of these white men in suits coming in and saying, we're here for the mines, and Salvadorans saying, we already got rid of the mines, meaning in their mind, the land mines from the Civil War, they meant gold. They knew, the mining companies knew there was gold there. And they started, and as you said, Bill, they started selling the benefits that most would think come with mining. Good jobs, lots of revenues. This was development. And people initially—
Other infrastructure too.
Infrastructure too, roads, exactly. And they did build a big road through the middle of the northern part of El Salvador that no one uses now because there's no mining, but which El Salvador has to repay. But the people initially were intrigued, then They had very close ties with groups right across the big river that goes through El Salvador that would have been contaminated by mining. They go to Honduras, they see the toxic effects of large-scale mining, and they become skeptical, and they start organizing, they start educating, they start learning. And that's 2002, 3, 4, up through the moment that Robin's described in 2009.
Great. Robin, back to you. So tell us about the antagonist of this story. We'll come back to Marcelo, his family, and the colleagues that he has there, and the very good works that they were doing. But your antagonist at the beginning was also trying to present this mining company that you'll tell us about, was trying to do some good work too. Tell us about how they maneuvered in the different provinces of El Salvador. Give us some context there, because El Salvador, from the Civil War, has this residue of conservatives and liberals. Talk about the local kind of political situation, who might be allied with whom, and how progressive advocacy works in that country.
Another great question, Bill. So I'm gonna just to back up a little and give a bit of background to that. So in order to write this book, we wanted to channel the voices of the water defenders, but also to channel the voices of those who were trying to mine. We needed, we're not gonna call them the good guys and bad guys, but we needed two sides to the story. And when we reached out to the relevant mining companies, they wouldn't have anything to do with us. They wouldn't talk to us, whatever. And so this book could not have happened. But one of the many twists and turns and serendipity or fate, depending on what you believe, happened when well, two things. One, because of the lawsuit at the World Bank, there were some documents that were made public by both that venue and by the Salvadoran government. In addition, and I won't go into the details of how, except to say it was totally legal, we found ourselves with a box of internal documents from the mining companies that included, well, it included letters they had sent, copies of emails, but it also included internal documents that they wrote to each other. So on one hand, these mining companies are competing with each other. On the other hand, they're sharing strategies for meeting with the Minister of Environment, the Minister of Econ, and other internal documents, such as paying students to sit in on meetings of the water defenders and pretend they're water defenders and send notes back. So we were actually extremely lucky, again, serendipity or fate, that this was even better than interviews, because this was a written word. So
documents.
They were, and that allowed us even more clearly than we ever imagined to see how the mining company executives, the engineers, the hydrologists, the geologists, how they thought. And so a lot of some of what you're talking about, and we convey in the book, is that their view of progress was that they were bringing progress to Northern El Salvador. They were bringing modern equipment. They were bringing jobs. As the CEO of one of these mining companies says, actually, this is on a Canadian Broadcast Corporation show. She says, these people subsist on corn and beans. Of course they have to be for mining. And that's not, she's not evil, but that's how she sees the world. As opposed to Miguel or Marcelo or another of our protagonists, Vidalina Morales, who are those corn and bean farmers who are desperate to save their water and their land. And for them, the ability for their children to grow corn and have a better life than they do. Of course, we all want that for our children, but for them, that's progress. And And saving the water, saving the Lempa River, the river John talked about, is key to that. So you have this clash that is behind almost everything that happens, and behind as the companies try and woo
mayors.
as the companies try and woo those mayors in, well, first of all, in the more left-wing provinces, the people just kick them out. But the area we focus on is actually a place that during the Civil War until recently was governed by more right-wing mayors. And it's a story that we all know well. They pay for parties, the mining companies pay for parties for the mayor. The mining companies pay for English lessons. They bring in lessons to the schools about how mining will bring progress. And the mayors are interested in part because they're getting this up front, but also if mining comes to a place like El Salvador, typically the way countries have set up the tariff fee, the taxes on mining, some percent goes to the local level. In El Salvador's case, it would be 1%, and some percent goes to the national level. In El Salvador's case, again, 1%.
And that would be the,
that leaves 98%.
that would be the legitimate proceeds, returns on the investment.
Okay, so you said that, I didn't. Yes, I mean, but
that we all know that there are other tactics involved. John, I think we need to understand, and Robin got us going on this by talking about the corn and the beans, but also they'd had experience with fish in the rivers and the livelihoods of these people, and how much of the population depends on that river. Tell us about what has happened in places like Honduras, and what evidence is there of the mining industry when they proceed with their pits and excavation? What is the science, and what ends up happening to the ecosystem and to people?
Sure, thanks. And a lot of what Robin and I learned about this, we learned from these folks on the ground who themselves became experts, studied hydrology, studied other things. Yeah, mining, unfortunately, we're all sitting here surrounded by things that are made up of minerals. It's very hard to do industrial mining without having a really harsh impact on the environment. And it's for a couple of reasons. One, it takes a lot of water to mine. You use water in the processing of getting the minerals out of the rocks. But secondly, you use this very toxic chemical cyanide in most industrial mining, which then covers the rocks that you've smashed up and you've extracted the gold from. And it's very hard to keep that from escaping. They try to keep them in tailings ponds, it escapes, it gets into the river. And El Salvador, I can't think of another country that has so much dependence on one large watershed. The Lempa River and its tributaries supply water to over half of the population. So that's why it became such a critical issue. But and the Lempa River, by the way, it starts in Guatemala, it snakes up through Honduras, and then it plunges down through El Salvador. So it can get contaminated in other places. And what they learned when they went to Honduras, it had a coup in 2009. The coup allowed the mining companies to pour in. So there were many different, and even before the coup, there were a lot of mines operating. Yes, they saw, as you said, the toxic impacts of cyanide in killing fish, a lot of it in skin diseases, a lot of it in, knocking out the local ecosystem, and of course getting in the water and going downstream. So the history of mining and water is a very contentious one. The other thing they learned, and people who live in Pennsylvania and Nevada and other places in the US where there's been a lot of mining know this, is that when the mining company leaves, the environmental problems in most of these places continue, because in about half of the mines in the world, there's sulfides in the rock. They get exposed in the mining, and every time it rains for hundreds of years afterwards, that turns into sulfuric acid, and it leaches whatever else is in there. It might be arsenic, it might be iron. The rivers of Pennsylvania for 30 to 40 to 50 years before the 1970s were orange from this very effect. So, everybody's seen Westerns where the mining companies come in and they leave. They the environmental problems stay. That's what people figured out there. And that's why the opposition became so widespread.
And they were very creative about how they educated their villagers. You tell a delightful, you said a delightful scene where Marcelo, one of the protagonists who later is assassinated, and he's not the only one. Talk about the use of culture to protest what they see coming and why they're so passionate about it, Robin.
So Marcelo, who again, we never met, but we've spent lots of time with his friends and family hearing stories of him, although it took us some years until we were brave enough to ask them about him. But Marcelo was a brilliant cultural worker. And part of his brilliance was his use of humor. Not just his use of theater and drama, but his use of humor. So they didn't just have protests, they had laugh fests where everyone wore a red clown nose. And so he made it fun, even though along the way, he and his colleagues were teaching a broader group of citizens about those kinds of effects that John talked about. I think the thing you're talking about is the soccer game, Bill. I think
Yes.
you're referring to the soccer game.
Also.
Sorry?
Also, and he dresses up as a costume, that's like Peter Pan.
Folk hero in El Salvador, Cepitio, who is like Peter Pan, the little boy who never grows up, who has his feet on backwards. And Marcelo often wears that costume. And in fact, that's how people were more likely to call him Cepitio than Peter Pan. But the difference between Cepitio and Peter Pan is Cepitio actually teaches lessons without scolding. He teaches lessons. So it was a perfect guise, a perfect costume for talking about mining. For some years, John and I tried to figure out why it was Marcelo was the first person to be assassinated. And we came to the conclusion is that's precisely why, because he, of course, others did it too. He taught youth how to do it at a community radio station, but he was the genius behind this in this one area, the genius of turning what could be a grim and determined protest against, let's face it, a small municipality in northern El Salvador taking on, well, trying to convince a government, their own government, to stop mining, never mind taking on a global mining company. The odds of that are tiny, tiny, tiny. I mean, John and I years later admitted to each other that we didn't think this had any chance of success, but we didn't say that to each other when we plunged into to work with them.
Well, I'm glad you didn't say it to them either.
I've never said it to them.
But you might as well also relate the story about the soccer game, because that's funny too. I mean, that is funny. The other stuff wasn't.
You go ahead and relate that story.
Sure. So, I mean, again, think of big corporations in developing countries have a large PR department. They often set up foundations. That's what this big mining company, Pacific Rim, did. Latin America, what's the favorite sport? It's soccer. They call it football. So Pacific Rim sponsors a soccer tournament in this area. And Marcelo and Miguel say, okay, one, we're good soccer players, and two, let's use this against them. So they put together their own team. Their own team is Stop Pacific Rim. They win. They get new uniforms for Pacific Rim. They write again, stop, end to Pacific Rim out on the back. So they turn what is a big community event into a very clever way to point out to people that the mining company is not there for them. So anyway, lots of things like that. Now, what that did is it won over the population there. They then faced the problem that, okay, they're up in the north, and to ban mining or to take action against mining, it's gonna require the whole country. So it's at that point once they've got the backing of the local public that they say, we got to go national, and they go to San Salvador, the capital, and they begin to spread the story and organize other groups, women's groups, environmental groups, labor groups, faith groups, youth groups, to join together and to make this a national campaign.
And that's really, I mean, it's really important that you say that, because, and you treat it very well, and the importance of getting the Catholic Church involved. You note that the other guys, the Pacific Rim Company, if I'm using the correct name, which is the mining firm, they reel in a former finance minister who had World Bank background, right? And is talking about all of a sudden how what used to be the projection of 400 something jobs becomes some outlandish 36,000 jobs. So it's a real, there's constant battling among various groups to basically settle the score. Are we going to mine or aren't we going to mine? And it left me wondering, how even does a company like Pac Rim get the concession in the first, like, how do they get to do that? And how do they get to sue when they're not getting their way? What tactics do they turn to beyond, you know, recruiting a former finance minister?
So I think your questions have great multiple questions within them, but
we only have an hour, so.
And I have to teach at 5:30, so we can't go far over the hour. But first, it's important to explain every country has its own rules of about how you get permission to mine. But in most countries, there are two sets of permits. First, you get permission to explore. You get that from the national government in most countries. In some countries, you get it from provincial governments. Once you explore, and of course, as a mining company, you're exploring to see if there's enough, in this case, gold, to make it worth your while. And then you apply for an actual mining permit or a concession, a license to mine. That Pacific Rim, which we can just call Oceana Gold, because Oceana Gold buys out Pacific Rim, and that's an easier, since Oceana Gold still exists, and Pacific Rim doesn't, that's easier. So they bought from another company the rights to explore. So they had the rights to explore. They never got the right to mine. They never completed their environmental impact assessment, among other things. So actually the story should have ended there, but given this, the way international economic, international corporate law is written, a company has the right to sue a government if the government takes away future profits. No.
And that is the issue of the tribunal within the World Bank.
No. Pacific Rim and its lawyers conveniently ignored the detail that they didn't yet have a mining concession. So they really shouldn't have been able to sue. But they, in this venue, the corporations who can hire these fancy lawyers are so used to winning that they just conveniently ignored that detail when they sued El Salvador. And they sued El Salvador saying that El Salvador was putting in place environmental laws that would take away the company's future profits. I can't stress future profits enough. In other words, they're not saying we have equipment there that you confiscated, pay us back for that. They're assuming some future price of gold, and they sued El Salvador for $300 million. Now, typically what happens is a country like El Salvador is so nervous about these lawsuits that it either just says, okay, you can mine here, or it says, okay, let's reach a compromise. We'll pay you $150 million instead of 300. But in this case, and it's fascinating, this also fascinated us because it's not just the progressive government, it's also the conservative government. In this case, the science behind the effects of mining on water convinced so many people that small El Salvador stood strong with its own, fortunately, brilliant lawyer, and with the help of global groups that rallied media and people around the globe to make this case extremely well known.
You gave away the story.
Oh, no.
Just kidding.
No, as we say, I purposely skipped parts.
No, I know you did. I know you did. I'm teasing you, but it's a good place to suspend my inquiry, because the questions are mounting from the audience, which is always exciting, and we will find out why a company can claim future profits, including, if never mind the price of gold, that they haven't even struck a vein yet. So we don't even know what the deposits are there. I don't know how that happens, but here's a question from Devin Pacheco in Albuquerque with the council there. Was there any form of water governance already present in the locations, in the provinces?
So two quick responses. First to your question, Bill, and then to this very good one from New Mexico. As you were saying, how did this come into being? I would say and this is really important for the audience, because rules are made by people, they can be changed by people. A lot of these rules, like the rules that allow corporations to sue governments, were set in place in the 1980s, 1990s, under this free market, sort of extreme free market fundamentalism of Reagan, Thatcher, and others. The rules were skewed way in favor of corporations over governments. Many governments didn't like it. Many citizens movements haven't liked it. Some governments have withdrawn from these agreements. This is an area of massive debate in the world today. There's a lot of pressure on the Biden administration to stop putting these provisions in future trade agreements. So I just want to say this book is like a case study. It's a poster child for why these rules are unfair and need to be changed, and they can be changed. Just back to New Mexico just for a second, another state, New Mexico reminds me of El Salvador in terms of being very water scarce. So yes, governments have been conscious of this for a long, long time. However, no, in El Salvador, there has been very little national or province level protections on water. And this story sort of exemplifies why. The country has been open for investment. A lot of investment is big hotels or mining companies or whatever that do have a devastating impact on water. Right now, one of the major fights in El Salvador is because the government wants to privatize a lot of municipal water systems. Very same fight that's going on across the United States. And again, the same movements who fought mining are now coming together to protect the people's right to water, which to them means municipal water systems should be publicly owned.
We are talking to John Cavanagh and Robin Broad, co-authors of The Water Defenders, about El Salvador's experience in defeating the mining powers that were, and still are in other places. A question from Stephen Davis. This is a global issue. The film Thunderheart, depicting the leaching of uranium drill holes into the watershed and the efforts to stop the Keystone Pipeline, come to mind. To what extent did you find the communities communicating with each other to resist environmental devastation?
So that's yet another great question, and something we write about in this book. So this book is the story of El Salvador and two major victories against big mining companies, big corporations. But we wouldn't have written this book if it were just the story of El Salvador. As we say in the book, it's the story of communities like the one in northern El Salvador and countries like El Salvador all over the world who are dealing with the same kind of battles and the same kind of issues, whether it's uranium or coal in West Virginia, or a pipeline, or the Pebble Beach in Alaska. And not only are the tactics that the water defenders of El Salvador use of interest, but in the book, we call some of the major lessons that we think led this could have been a totally, this is a somewhat depressing story. People were killed. There were blood, sweat, and tears that went into these victories. But there was no, there was no sign that the water defenders were gonna win. They could have easily lost if they didn't do a combination of things, from having a very strong social movement to, one thing we haven't talked about, although you alluded to it, Bill, is they bravely reached out to what we call unlikely allies, people who could well, like the Opus Dei Archbishop, who initially, and could have continued to slam the door in their face and say, we don't want anything to do with you, and to how they worked with this group of international allies globally. And to just wrap up, just like groups in the US, be it in New Mexico or Colorado or Montana or New Hampshire or elsewhere, just as they are reaching out with each other and learning lessons from each other, the water defenders of El Salvador have become somewhat famous, not necessarily in the US, but they've been invited to Ecuador. They've talked to what we're calling the water defenders of Ecuador. A governor from the Philippines, actually, where Oceana Gold mines, was brought to El Salvador. And this story I'm not gonna tell in full, but he becomes a key protagonist at instrumental in one part of this victory. And then he brings the water defenders and us to El Salvador to talk to mining communities there who were fighting the same mine, to not just meet with them, but to give them some kind of hope. Our next stop is, so this mining company mines in South Carolina, and it also mines in northern New Zealand. And I don't know our next book, but our next stop in terms of this work is going to be northern New Zealand. But yes,
wow.
I mean, the lessons are being shared.
John, who is the real muscle in this battle for the El Salvadorans? We've done some work, collaborations recently with the International Labor Organization. Were they helpful, or was there another body that really came through internationally?
Yeah, internationally, it was a coalition of groups. We held large protests in front of the World Bank. We did big petitions both to Oceana Gold and to the World Bank Tribunal. Yes, the biggest global civil society group in the world, the one with the most members, is the International Trade Union Confederation. And they came in. It was interesting. Their bottom line was they wanted to know what the unions in El Salvador thought. The unions in El Salvador said, we're fine fighting mining. Mines had been closed for many years in El Salvador. So with that, you've got the 180 million member strong International Trade Union Confederation, but big environmental groups, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, the Sierra Club, faith groups. And of course, in the US, we've got 2 million of the 8 million or so Salvadorans are here in the United States, a lot of them in the Washington area. So they got involved as well. And one other important thing to say here is in El Salvador, we didn't really get into this, but we mentioned the National Coalition. They also brilliantly found allies in government. So there were key people in the national legislature who were educated about this, who joined in, and in government. One of the great heroes in this book is a woman named Lena Paul, who was the Minister of the Environment, and who turned out to be a great ally. Not always closely coordinating, but it's a reminder that to win against big odds, in this case, yeah, you needed local groups, national groups, and global groups, and you needed people from civil society and government, and even business. So big agribusiness does not want the rivers contaminated. Big tourism do not want the rivers contaminated. So think creatively. Partly it changed the way we think about about fighting for the environment and fighting for justice, because they were so creative in this case. They would have lost if they weren't.
Interesting. That's a good, I'm going to switch up the questions because that's a good lead in to a question I'll pose to Robin. And this comes from Quanta Dawn Light. What effective ways can U.S. and global corporate leaders be encouraged to see the world as our home and treat it with motivation on these principles of social justice and protection of the environment and so forth?
Oh my, what a beautiful question. That question actually brought tears to my eyes because of course that's such a key thing. So we've been talking here about protagonists and antagonists, but of course the key challenge is to understand each other so that it doesn't come to this. And my gut to whoever asked that question is that you already know the answer because you're in the audience listening to us. But a lot of it is just being open to listening. So one of the things I talked about, the documents that John and I were given from the mining companies. One of the things that became really clear to us was that in this particular case, the relevant corporate executives did not want to learn. They did not want to really listen to the complaints from the local people. They also were so arrogant and so sure of themselves. Again, small country El Salvador, of course we can go in and mine wherever we want. Conservative government in power, or desperately in need of foreign exchange. Of course we, the mining companies, can get what we want. So they didn't even try and build alliances with local companies, with the private sector. Now, I'm not saying that would have worked, as John said, at that point in time. By 2002, the local private sector was not doing mining. It was in agribusiness and other things that depended on the water. But so I'm not sure there was any way that the mining companies could have succeeded in El Salvador, given what the water defenders did. But I think a key lesson is not to just assume that we all have the same definition of progress, not to just assume that everyone wants or needs 2 cars and I don't know, I shouldn't say filet mignon, but giant prawns or whatever we're eating, not to assume that the goals are the same. On the other hand, there are so many shared values. Everyone wants their kids to be well educated. I think I haven't found anyone who says, no, I don't want my kids to have a better life than I have. But truly a conversation. Before one, so the mining companies started digging holes, and in the exploration holes already dried up springs and mucked up the water table for certain people.
Right,
And
even without the victory of what they were trying to do, they really did cause some harm, as you detail.
so it has to happen earlier, and I think it has to really be honest on both sides. Now, let me repeat something that John may have said is, in the beginning, Marcelo, Miguel, Vidalina, our protagonists from Northern El Salvador, they were really excited about mining coming in. They thought jobs, we're going to have jobs, we're going to make some money. This is a really poor, but the assumption that they would stay at that point, they would stay in that thinking and not learn more about mining. And the way the mining company came in, so there's a scene we tell where the mining company comes, mining companies hold these consultations, and the person doing it holds up something and says, this is cyanide. And to show you that cyanide is not poisonous, I'm going to drink this with horchata, with the local non-alcoholic beverage. And assuming that, as Miguel says to us, they just assumed that we were ignorant peasants with big hats, but we're not that ignorant no matter how big our hats are. And so the audience says to them, okay, let us get you some real cyanide. Let us make sure it's cyanide, and then you drink it. and then you drink it with horchata. And of course, then the person doing the consultation disappears. So it's just, you have to truly want to dialogue. You have to.
You'll need a magician to sort of get rid of that drink and drink something else. I mean, the context goes well. I mean, you lay it out in what's going on in real time, or the contemporary narrative, but you also provide some interesting history, which to me also, as a Massachusetts guy, there's a character, Charles Butters, who is the genius who figures out that cyanide would be a better solution than, I guess, whatever they were using before to separate the rock from the gold. It's really fascinating on so many levels. This is a question, you know, it's very interesting in terms of global governance. Comes from David Peter in Canby, Oregon. Can there be an international tribunal for worldwide environmental crimes like the War Crimes Tribunal? Would it work? I mean, we're probably going to get there. John, what do you think? Is the Institute of Policy Studies doing this?
Great question. The big problem we have in the world right now in terms of global rules is a huge imbalance between the rules Robin just described, where corporations can sue governments, and which are enforced with sanctions and fines, and international environmental, indigenous women's rights, which aren't. Where if you're found violating them, nothing is done to you. So a huge issue for us all over the next 20 years is how to balance those. In our view, you balance them two ways. One, in future trade and investment agreements, you take out this provision. And so, for example, in the new US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, there's no, companies cannot sue governments between the US and Canada. They still can in some sectors with Mexico. So it's still unequal, it's wrong, but newer agreements are leaving some of these rules out. So that's number one, remove that. And then yes, add in sanction. I mean, this is like right now, environmental rights have no standing in that tribunal at the World Bank. They didn't argue, the great lawyer of El Salvador could not go in there and say they're poisoning the river. He had to go in there and say they did something wrong as this very narrow tribunal rules are written. In a more just world, yes, if you are sitting in a community and a corporation is dumping toxic waste into the river and into the air, there should be a way, if it's a global company. I mean, you want local courts and national courts to handle most of this. You do not want global tribunals who can overrule that. But if it's a foreign company in a country, US company in Mexico, dumping toxic waste into the river, you do want the right of those communities to go to a tribunal and bring a case against that company. So in a more just world, you would flip that, one. And two, let me just say one other thing on the corporate. I so agree with what Robin said about dialogue and conversation. But the other key thing, and we're sitting here, Robin and I, about 2 blocks from DC in the state of Maryland. In the state of Maryland, if you want to incorporate a corporation, you can either incorporate it as a limited liability for-profit corporation, where you have a charter that says your only goal is to maximize returns to shareholders, which is what leads companies to do the sorts of things these mining companies do. Or you can incorporate as a for-benefit corporation, where your charter says you must maximize benefits to a range of stakeholders, the community, the workers, as the consumers, as well as the shareholders. If more companies were chartered that way, the sort of thing the story we just described in El Salvador would not have happened. And again, I think 20 years from now, a lot more of the world's corporations, through a lot of protests from all of us, will be chartered that way, not as for-profit companies.
Very interesting. I have to go to our intern, Paige Chickering, who is also Robin's student, I believe, at American University. And the one, Paige, thank you for bringing us these 2 excellent authors and thinkers on this, I mean, and doers. So Paige has like me, a tendency to ask multi-part questions. So I'm only gonna pick a few of them. But she wants to know, what role does corruption play in incentivizing mining and other companies and the processes that they employ to be environmentally devastating, and how can you address corruption, not just in El Salvador, but you've got broad experience in the developing world, the Philippines and elsewhere. What is the best way to get regulations and structures in place to disincentivize that corruption?
Well, let me start. Thank you, Paige. Thank you so much. Let me start, and John, you can come in. First, I have to say one thing about. I have to go back to the El Salvador story. When we, like many people, first heard that this was 2008, 2009, that the government of President Saca in El Salvador was not letting this company mine, we jumped to the assumption that it was because PAC Rim had not offered a large enough incentive. This is, in Page terms, a bribe to Saca. You know, whatever was passed in the underground parking lot wasn't big enough. That was our assumption, and that was many people's assumptions. We actually did not find that to be the case. So to the extent what one could call corruption happened, it was actually these kind of legal corporate social responsibility things where it was, okay, we'll build you a school, we'll teach English, if you let us in, we'll do this and do that. On the other hand, there were numerous secret meetings between high-level officials, both left and right parties in El Salvador, both the Arena party and the FMLN party, where the top officials of PAC Rim, then Oceana Gold, held secret meetings to try and make deals. Some of these deals were not surprising. They were, okay, does the government of El Salvador want to own a share of this? We'll make you a joint owner. You'll get some percent, we'll actually do the mining. And in essence, the company being willing to give away some of its profit to be able to mine there. And some of these that we recount in the book are so outrageous that they seem unbelievable, but they're not. There was a meeting. We learned quickly that one of the best ways to be investigative reporters or investigative scholars in a place like El Salvador is to hang out in the lobby of the best hotels, which is where the top government officials and the mining executives hang out, and you can overhear conversations. So there was one meeting where the proposal between the mining companies and three top Salvadoran officials, not the president, but three very, very top officials. There was this, to me as an ecologist, an inane discussion about cutting the country in half and allowing mining on one side and not mining on the other side. This was a serious discussion. Now, anyone in the audience who knows anything about how rivers flow or about, well, anyone in the, I mean, this reminds us of how Africa was carved up, right? The colonial powers so it was not so much in this case, corruption, or what when we think of as corruption, as it was legalized bribing and conniving without accountability, without sunlight. So these are the things that did not happen in public.
Well, and also, I mean, as bad as that is, I'd like to know, John, I mean, you describe a number of very brutal murders. Marcelo was tortured before he was dumped in a well. Was it ever dangerous for you?
You know,
you weren't always in that 5-star hotel. I know that.
No, we stayed up in the north. people who know US history in Latin America know in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, throughout Latin America, Americans were among those who were picked up and killed or disappeared. Less now in Central America because the governments are desperate for US aid. So far less dangerous for us than ordinary Salvadorans, particularly poor ones who don't have big names. And I think that's why those who killed the water defenders thought they could get away with it. Just one other point related to this, and it's on the point of corruption too. A lot of the way you fight it has to do with scale, which means the more you dump large amounts of money into countries, and this includes, I mean, the United States, there's massive corruption in our military contractors that get tens of billions of dollars worth of contracts. But there, and this is so important for this moment, the Biden administration is proposing a $4 billion package for these three countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, where most of the people coming north are from. And 340 faith-based groups in the US and smaller development groups are saying, don't do it the usual way. Don't give big, massive amounts to massive projects, which is where money is skimmed off, where there is corruption, and where you often inevitably reinforce the power of authoritarian governments. We know how to give aid in small amounts and small packages, often governed by small nonprofits. The more you do that, and the same is true with corporations, the more it is small companies going in to do fair trade coffee, which thrives in El Salvador, the less chance there is that either large corporate interests or wealthy individuals will skim off money and perpetuate corruption.
Well, with a few minutes to go, I want to say how much I've enjoyed this speaking with you, and also that to my colleagues in the council network across the country, that John and Robin are familiar with councils. They have a history which New Hampshire can learn about this association with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, among others. Your other collaborations, among them are the wonderfully titled Plundering Paradise, about the struggle to protect the environment in the Philippines, and Development Redefined, which is a very important, I want to take your course on development, Robin, but these are scholarly. These are more scholarly. These are, you are scholars, and this book makes me green, if I can use the pun, green with envy, because of as a former journalist, I think you've done it beautifully. And I want to come with the remaining minutes of an experience that I can bring right home to nearby Washington, D.C., that I have been looking for a new house, and went to Harper's Ferry, which is a lovely area, and was nearly going to purchase one there. And I went a little north to another gorgeous town called Shepherdstown, where there were signs on certain lawns with skulls and red crosses against a company, a Danish company called Rockwool. Rockwool is a manufacturer of a really widely used insulation that's in commercial and residential real estate. And they have already a plant in Mississippi. And it turns out that a few years ago, they managed to work the government of West Virginia and got tax breaks to build a plant in Ranson in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia. And I'm thinking, I got to write this story myself, because literally what is on the table is 150 jobs paying 35 to 85,000. They tout the job creation in exchange for a plant with a couple of smokestacks, 21 stories high, that will, for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, spew formaldehyde, which is a possible carcinogen, benzene, which is a carcinogen. It will affect the water because of the sinkholes that they will do to get rock. Trucks that bring the slag and the other kinds of rocks big trucks will lumber on the roads that cyclists and tourists use around Harper's Ferry, and they will blow air, bad air, into Maryland, into Virginia, Loudoun County. They will pollute the waters there, but the Potomac and other waters, all for 150 jobs on a former orchard site where there are elementary schools. It is astounding to me, and this is the one, here I am on my soapbox thinking, this is for 150 jobs.
I'm
Start doing your report. No, this is a story that clearly needs someone with reporting background to help spread the word. That it's outrageous. And I mean, the sad thing is, it's the story that could have happened in northern El Salvador. It's a story that sounds like, unless something changes, it's going to happen in Ranson. But it's also thousands, hundreds of thousands, I don't know how many, millions of stories around the world that can be hopeful stories like that of El Salvador, but won't be unless there is organizing and very creative.
And it's just like the miners too, by the way, Robin, that the green element, the green mining, this PR is like the greenness of this insulation. And I have no doubt it's true. The end product will save on heating, and it will, be so efficient and so on and so forth, that there is certainly a green element of the product that they produce that everybody uses. But what's happening in that area, and it's probably no surprise that it's in West Virginia and Mississippi, is devastating to the environment. So thank you for your work. Thanks for letting me prattle on there, because I'm not really allowed to do that. But it was such a profound experience that every time I was turning a page of your book, I was thinking, I just decided not to buy a house because of that very thing. But I feel like I should join an action committee or something. Anyway, Robin Broad and John Cavanagh are the authors of The Water Defenders: How Ordinary People Saved a Country from Corporate Greed. Read about El Salvador, look into their bios on our website, and please invite them to your councils, either virtually or when things open up and you all can travel again. But it's a pleasure. Thanks, Paige Chickering, for introducing us.
Thank you for a delightful hour.
Thanks so much, Bill.
Right.
I predict that in 2 years, we'll be interviewing you on your new book.
We can only hope. I got to go raise some money for the council network. So after that. All right.
Okay, stay in touch. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.